Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of our podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, you will see that today it is only me because Jesse isn't here. He is enjoying his well-deserved holiday back home in Canada. So you have to make do with me, which for me is on the one hand, of course, quite sad because I like the interaction with Jesse. On the other hand, it also gives me the idea to hijack this particular edition of the podcast and to talk about a subject that I really find absolutely fascinating, probably more fascinating than Jesse. So I'm just using this episode to get one of my hobby horses out of the way and basically torture you with my thoughts on a particular, not only battle or campaign, but a war. And this is the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. This war, quite often overlooked when we look at the Second World War, is actually absolutely crucial because it is part of these tensions that you find in Europe in the interwar period. And it's also in many ways a testing ground for some of the main belligerents, in particularly Germany, Italy, and of course the Soviet Union, the main belligerents of World War II, who used the Spanish Civil War as a bit of a testing ground for new weaponry, new techniques, new tactics, and all these things. So it is a really, really interesting and fascinating war, and it really deserves some attention. You might have picked up on the fact that I enjoy the interwar period. The interwar period is an interesting one, generally speaking, because the term interwar implies that not a lot happens because it sits between the two big wars, the First World War and the Second World War. But far from it. There's a lot that happens in that particular period, like the Spanish Civil War. There's a lot that happens in the Far East. We mentioned a few things in previous podcasts. And of course, there is a wealth of other things that happen as well. For example, the development of what we now call blitzkrieg. We talked about blitzkrieg and whether that is the right term, yes or no. So the intellectual interaction with war and thinking about the next war is something that really, really happens. So intellectually, it's a very fruitful, a very exciting time. And I would say that because I wrote my PhD about the interwar period as well. Not only the Spanish Civil War, I wrote it about German tactical and operational thinking and the development. So it's a slightly different subject, but as already said, linked to the Spanish Civil War to a degree because the Germans used this as a testing ground. And I think what I'm going to do, normally I would now throw the ball back to Jesse, into Jesse's court, so we could start talking about the wider and bigger context. So I'll just do it, obviously, myself today. And I'm going to take you back right to antiquity. That's normally not what we do, but I think here for the Spanish Civil War and the understanding of Spain, it's actually quite important. So in antiquity, you could go all the way back to Hannibal and Carthage, but that's probably a bit too much. Let's start with the fact that Spain is a Roman province. It remains like that for quite some time until, no need for detail here, the Western Roman Empire collapses. You've got the Germanic tribes that come in. And in Spain, you have, for about 200 years, in the early Middle Ages, you've got the Visigoths that run the country. Roughly speaking, 200 years, from the capital, Toledo. We'll return to Toledo later on, but this is a very, very important place to remember because when we think about Spain today, of course we think about Barcelona because some of you, particularly the European listeners, might have been on holiday, and of course the capital, Madrid. The capital, Madrid, is, you might say, very much an artificial capital and city. It was really founded as a city only in the 16th century because it's right bang in the center of the country. But up to that stage, the real capital was in Toledo. And Toledo is not only the political center, it is also the religious center because the Bishop of Toledo is extremely senior, is a very important man even today. And it also is, if we jump forward a little bit to the early modern period, it also becomes a center for literacy. Cervantes, for example, who wrote Don Quixote, he lives and writes in Toledo. So it's a very, very important place for lots of reasons. So if you are British, you might say that Toledo is a little bit like London. This is where you have the political center. It's a little bit like Canterbury, because that's where the Archbishop of Canterbury sits. And it's also a little bit like, for example, Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare came from. So you get an idea about the importance. And this is why we will return to this a little later. But before we do this, let's return again and go back to the Visigoths. So they run the country. They adopt some of the Roman fashion, but then there are some tensions, some struggles within this kingdom. And they quite foolishly, you might say, some of these factions invite the Moors. So these are the Arabs that now sit in North Africa. They invite them to come across and to help one of these factions in this fight. And as it always happens, when you invite a different group, a different tribe, a different nation, whatever it is, to join your struggle, they might help you first, but then they probably see that, there's a bit more to be gained here. And this is exactly what happens. So without any great detail here, in the next few hundred years, the Moors conquer pretty much all of Spain. And Spain, or at least parts of Spain, remain under Moorish, i.e. Arab influence, control, government for several hundred years. This is really important. I would argue you can even see that in the Spanish language today, because when you might speak a little bit of Spanish or understand a bit of Spanish, some of the words, some of the pronunciations sound a little bit Arabic. And there is a reason for that, and this is exactly that they were under Arab control for centuries. They also go into France, modern-day France, or the Frankish Empire. There they are defeated by a chap called Karl Martel, which translates as Karl the Hammer, and then they withdraw, and then you've got a very, very uneasy border, you might say, around the Pyrenees and just to the south of the Pyrenees. Should you find this really interesting, here's the first tangent of a tangent, you might say. There are some interesting, not only research, but also very important poetry from the early Middle Ages, and this is the famous the Roland epos, which is Roland. He was someone who fought with Charlemagne, and Charlemagne goes into northern Spain to fight against the Moors. Then they retreat, and on the way back there's an ambush, and the Frankish knights and their army are defeated. And Roland, he is the great hero. He dies in the fight, but it's a very heroic man, a very heroic story. And this Roland becomes one of the, you might say, one of the most important figureheads and symbols of Christianity in Europe for the next, probably about 1,000 years. Today, I wouldn't say forgotten, but not a lot of people know too much about him. But there we are. Should you be interested, find the Roland saga, the Roland epos, and you can read all about this. What you then have is the so-called Reconquista. During the Reconquista from the north, the Christians begin to reconquer, that's what Reconquista means, the Spanish word, they begin to reconquer the Spanish mainland. It's a very long struggle. It takes several hundred centuries, but in the end they manage to push the Moors back and back and back. So first from the areas of Navarra and Aragon, which is up in the north, then into the center, which is Castilla, so Castile, then further down towards Cordoba. And in the end, in the 15th century, the Moors only hold a small piece of ground in the very south around Granada. And so everyone can see this is now only going to go one way. And of course, it then comes to the famous event, and that is 1492. In 1492, the Kingdom of Granada falls, and all of Spain is now in the hands of the Christians again, of the Spanish kings of Castile and Aragon. And this is an interesting period because we all know what happened in 1492. And that, of course, is Columbus going across to find a seaway to India, which takes him west, which, of course, means he finds America. And there's a reason why they sent out his fleet in 1492, because this is the time where Spain feels we've done it now, we've reconquered Spain, we are strong, we are powerful. They get this Italian guy in, Christopher Columbus, give him these ships and send him west. As a consequence of that, of course, the power of Spain now goes through the roof for the next few hundred years, because you have the Spanish Empire, which at that stage is the largest empire in the world. It covers vast areas to begin with, even of Northern America. So places like Texas, places like California, Louisiana, they're all under Spanish rule. And of course, in particular, most of Southern America. Pretty much with the exception of what then becomes Brazil, because that is given to Portugal. They also have a number of smaller colonies further to the east, for example, in India, Spanish East India as well, the Philippines. So the empire is extremely large, which leads to all sorts of other stories then that we don't have time to get into, because even for me, these tangents would be too far and wide stretch. But you can think about Pirates of the Caribbean, think Jack Sparrow and all these things. This is what happens because the Spanish have got the Silver Fleet that is sent across from the Caribbean to Spain. It also means that Spain is now extremely wealthy. It also means that Spain, because of the wealth, becomes extremely powerful. And what is interesting, because when we think about Spain today, we don't really think of Spain as a big economic power, not perhaps even a big political power, most definitely not a big military power. I served as a defense attaché in Madrid for a while, so it's an interesting relationship you have there, and also an interesting standing of the military and the funding of the military, the equipment, the size of the military. All this does not really point towards a big military, let's call it superpower. That was very different in the old days, and particularly in the 16th and early 17th century, the Spanish army was the best army probably in the world. They have very good equipment because they can buy it. They have a number of mercenaries they can employ because they can pay for them. They also have very good tactics that they use, so they organize the armies in a new way. They call them tercios, so that basically means these are thirds, so the way they organize them also with equipment. So some old equipment, you might say, with pikes and halberds, and some 1/3 then with muskets and things like this. So they're really, really efficient. But what you then have is that you already have, at that stage, a little bit of a beginning of a decline as well, because they're overstretching themselves. And that already starts in the 16th century, because they go to war with these very, very naughty people from what is now the Netherlands and northern Belgium, which come in those days under Spain, because that's why it's called the Spanish Netherlands. And these guys want independence. And that leads to an 80 years war that the Spanish fight against these rebellious provinces. And this is only settled in 1648, when at the end of the 30 Years' War, which runs then for 30 years alongside the 80 Years' War, Spain is completely exhausted and they have to give these provinces away. And then the Netherlands, in a different shape to begin with, are formed. And but this, again, leads us too far. I'm not going to go into detail. The only thing I'm going to say is that, of course, the one part of the Treaty of Westphalia, as it's called, which brings the 30 Years' War in 1648 to an end, is signed in the town hall of my hometown in Münster. And it's very interesting that even today you have a lot of Dutch visitors coming to Münster, also because it's quite close to the border, but also because this is technically where the Netherlands were founded. So there you have it. That's the 5 seconds of fame of my hometown, Münster, you might say. But this idea that Spain is powerful, this idea that Spain is one of the leading countries, not only in Europe, but probably in the world, is something that remains in the back of the people all the way into the 20th century. You can also see this expressed in the Spanish flag, for example, because when you look at it, you've got the red, you've got the yellow and the red, you've probably seen that. And then you've got a crest in the center as well. And it's interesting to look at this because there you have 2 pillars. And these 2 pillars are the pillars of Hercules. So one of the pillars of Hercules in Spain, some people say, well, it's the Gibraltar bit. Now you can argue whether Gibraltar is Spain or not. Let's not go there because that opens a whole Pandora's box. We don't need to go there, but in that area. And the other pillar is on the North African side. And what is then also interesting is when you look at what the writing is, because it says plus ultra on the flag. So even beyond. And that means that Spain is always going beyond. It's going beyond its natural borders. It's going to, in this case, to South America to have an empire, to basically, that's the idea behind that, perhaps rule parts of the world or the whole world. And this is really the understanding that people still have in the 19th century of the importance of Spain, even though that is not really mirrored in reality and the position of Spain in the world. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. I'm jumping ahead now because if we talk about everything and Spanish history, which is fascinating, but we'll again be here forever and it won't really be World War II, even though today we're not talking really about World War II at all, but about a previous conflict, which, as I said, is very, very important. But if I take you to the 19th and early 20th century, so big jump now for us. This really is a time of big political and economic tension in Spain. Because like in most other countries, you have socialist movements, you have land-owning classes, you've got a conservative elite, you've got urban and liberal classes that are forming. In Spain, the urban elite is smaller than in most other countries. You don't really have a lot of industrialization going on. So the land-owning class is perhaps even more powerful than in most other countries in Europe at that particular time. But it's part of this big European struggle, the rise of socialism, the rise of communism, all these things that you find. And that in Spain leads to 12 successful coups between 1814 and 1874. I mean, that in itself shows you that there's something is wrong in this country. And of course, this is something which is still pretty much within living memory when we go into the Spanish Civil War. The first constitution is signed in 1812. This also has to do with the invasion of Spain by Napoleon. But this constitution is then dissolved by a king called Ferdinand VII. And so you're a bit in limbo, you might say, when it comes to these modern developments. You also have a first short-lived republic, that is in 1873. But in 1874, the monarchy under the Bourbons is then re-established. So you can see a very, very confusing development that you find here, and one that not a lot of people really look at, because when you look at the 1870s, everybody, of course, looks at continental Europe, Central Europe, because this is the time of Italian unification, this is the time of the German Wars of Unification, and, of course, 1871, the establishment of the German Empire. But as we've now seen, other things are happening in other parts of Europe as well. And this situation continues. In the First World War, Spain remains neutral. The Spanish king is actually proposed to receive the Nobel Peace Prize because he was trying yet some number of peace initiatives, and he was also helping with the Red Cross to take care of the wound of both sides. But they stay neutral. But they can't really benefit from that. So other countries are able to gain a bit from this because you might sell equipment and machinery and weapons. Spain doesn't really have the industrial base to do that. So this really confusing situation that we find continues in Spain. And that then leads to another coup, and that's a military coup, which has also been called a military dictatorship, which is probably a bit strong. And this is in 1923. And the man who is the driving force here is a chap called Miguel Primo de Rivera. And then there are other ones, Berenguer, Aznar, Cabanas, so other people, but he's important because he's a famous general. He's got very good links to the monarchy as well. So he's basically tolerated by the monarch in his endeavors here. And the name will remain important because his son will play a very important role later on as well, and we'll return to this. And the slogan that he follows and that Spain follows then for the next 20 years or so is country, religion, and monarchy. And in many ways, you might say this is a very standard late 19th century order. For the Spanish, that really means something, the country, Spain itself. And the interesting thing is then religion comes before monarchy, because Spain, even today, at least on paper, is a very, very Catholic country. And that also is important to this whole confusing bit, because if you have socialists, you have communists who want to rebel against the existing order, of course, they have problems with the Catholic Church. So again, you can see lots of different areas, different factions, different problems coming in here, where they're economic, where they're class-based, where they're regional. That's another big factor, of course, that we even find today. Just think about Catalonia and these ideas of gaining independence. This is something that you had in those days as well. And of course, we have to understand that Spain is not only what most of us might think when we think of Spain. Well, let's face it, for most of us, Spain is going on a very sunny holiday, getting sunburned, drinking warm, cheap Spanish red wine, and then going home again. But there is a bit more to this country, obviously. And that also means you have very, very different areas. So the southern part of Spain, of course, is very arid, is very dry. You have, I would say, what we think is the Spanish culture mainly comes from the south of Spain. Northern Spain is completely different. I always say northern Spain, the area around Bilbao, for example, the Basque area, is a little bit like Bavaria by the sea. So it feels like you drive through the Alps, some Bavaria, Austria, and suddenly you hit the Atlantic. That's what it's like. It's very green, it's much cooler, it's much colder, which I would argue, and if you disagree, please leave comments in the chats. I think that also has an impact on the behavior of the people, because people from northern Spain tend to be much quieter, much calmer than people from southern Spain. You still find this today. It's really interesting. And the northern bit is also a bit more industrial because that's where you have coal mines. And they, of course, are, for all sorts of reasons, very, very important. And then you've got the area to the east, Catalonia, which, as I already said, even in those days, is a specific part, is different. The reason for that is the joining of different monarchies in Spain during and after the Reconquista. And the guys in Catalonia, even to this very day, feel a little bit different. They've got a different language, Catalan, which is now coming up again and coming to the fore under Franco, and we'll return to Franco, of course, later on. That was, they weren't encouraged to speak it, they weren't taught it at school. So you can see, again, all sorts of different problems and different tensions that you find in this country. This is why a country, religion, monarchy is really important. It also means monarchy coming last. So in some ways, you might say that's the weakest of the trinity here. And that also makes sense because, yes, you've got a king, but you also have this military coup. And actually, the guy who runs the show is Miguel Primo de Rivera, who is not the king. So it all kind of makes sense when you start to think this through. But then it continues to go very, very confusing. It gets very confusing. Again, I'm not talking too much about the first military dictatorship here now, because that in itself is very fascinating, but long story. But what you do find is in this period more calls for reform, in particular from in these urban areas where you have a little bit of this modern liberal thinking going on. And some parts are actually quite modern. If I remember correctly, Madrid is the first city in Europe to have electric street lighting. So you can see some of this is there, but across the country, it's a bit of a backward country. But they're putting pressure on the government now. And that means that on the 12th of April, 1931, the king calls for local elections, municipal elections, kind of trying to give the people a bit, I wouldn't say he's intending to move towards republic, but he's trying to give the people a little bit of a say in the state's affairs. Interesting enough, you have a victory for the socialists and the liberals, depending on where you are. And the king gets so annoyed by this because this is not what I subscribe to. I don't really want this now. And I can see that the population is against me because they want socialism or they want liberalism, but they don't want me as the king. So he abdicates and leaves the country. So quite a drastic move, you might say, caused by some minor local elections. That leads to the establishment of the Second Republic, which lasts until the end of the Spanish Civil War. And this is the one faction that we have fighting in the Spanish Civil War, the Republicans. Who are the leaders? Well, the most important person of the Spanish Republic is a chap called Manuel Azaña. He is the Prime Minister of the Republic from 1931 to 33 and also 1936. He then becomes the President of the Republic and remains so till the end of the Spanish Civil War. He then goes into exile and he dies in France on the 3rd of November 1940. Now, when we say the Republic, we think that, okay, these are all Democrats, they all kind of want the same thing. Yes, you've got different factions, as you always have in every democracy, whether it's Tory or Labour or Democrats or Republicans or whatever it might be. But in Spain, things are, as often, a bit more extreme. Because under this umbrella of the Republicans, you've got all sorts of different factions. It stretches from anarchists and communists on the very, very left to the urban liberal elite, so to speak, a bit more on the right. And Azaña, comes from a very liberal, from a very wealthy background. And he's very academic as well. The way he speaks is very academic. And that basically makes him unpopular with pretty much everybody, even within the Republican field, but also, of course, with the conservatives and in particular as you can imagine, the left circles. So there is a bit of a baggage here right from the beginning that he and the Republic have to carry as they go into the next period of tension. And everybody in Spain can feel that something is brooding, something will happen. It's a little bit like before the First World War, where everyone was looking at these tensions, saying we just need something to make this whole thing go up and make it explode. And what happens in Spain is exactly that. We have an incident like that. You have a number of right-wing groups planning coups and planning to take over the government already at that stage and beforehand. Some are thwarted, some just basically they're just talking. But you've got one group of people, and I'll return to them in a moment, who are a bit more serious. But they're waiting for the right sort of moment to start the big attack. And this moment, this instant, which makes everything explode, is an assassination. And the whole thing is really, again, very complex and very, very confusing. What happens is that on the 12th of July, 1936, a police lieutenant called José Castillo is killed by members of the Falange. The Falange is a very, very important movement in Spain at that particular time. It's run by the son of the Primo de Rivera that we mentioned earlier. Some people have said they're like the Nazis, like fascists. I don't think that is really right. They're quite right-wing. They're a bit, of course, they're anti-monarchy. They're also anti-church to a degree, which in Spain is always slightly difficult. But I don't think you can say they're like the Nazi party or like the Italian fascists. That would be too strong a word. They're leaning a little bit towards it, but they're not as radical. But within the Spanish system, for example, even being a little bit against the church is already quite a strong statement. Say, an interesting mix of people. So they go around and on the 12th of July assassinate this police lieutenant, José Castillo, who was faithful, was a supporter of the Republic. And as a reprisal, you might say, for this, the police itself then arrests someone, and that is José Calvo Sotelo. He comes from an extremely wealthy background, very well educated. He was a previous member of the government, a very, very senior member of the government. He is taken hostage and he's then killed by the police. And that, when you start to think about this is really interesting. So you've got a former member of the government, a very, very important member of Spanish society, killed by the police. And Brian Crozier, writing about this, once wrote, and I quote now, "It is hard perhaps to convey the enormity of this deed, for it is almost impossible to transport it to other countries and different circumstances. Senator Robert F. Kennedy, kidnapped and murdered by the FBI, unthinkable, one might say, and that is the point. In Spain in the summer of 1936, the unthinkable had become normal." So that puts it into context and shows you the enormity of this particular action, the assassination of Sotelo by the police, which of course at that stage was still loyal to the government. And this now sets in motion the uprising. So the conspirators, they get together. The government had already understood that something was brooding, something was happening, and they knew that it was really a military coup that was being prepared. So what you do, you take the leading military people and also the ones, of course, who you think are the main drivers behind the potential and future coup. You can either sack them, you can arrest them. They didn't want to go that far because they thought that might have been very difficult as well in the situation. So they sent them to all sorts of parts of the country, very, very unimportant postings they get. And one guy also goes into exile. And this is Lieutenant General José Sanjuro. He is also known as El León del Rif, so the Lion of the Rif. The Rif is a mountainous area in northern Africa. We'll return to this later on because Africa plays a really, really important role in the understanding of the Spanish nationalists. And this is part of the Spanish Empire at that stage. And this is where most of the military leaders, including Franco, we'll talk about him in a minute, make their names. So this is where the fighting happens. This is where you make your name as a military leader. And if you become known as the Lion of the Rif, you can already see that he is quite an important person. He's also the head of the civil guard, so the internal, let's call it military police, so to speak. But in 1932, because people know, well, he's up to something, he's demoted. And he becomes the chief of the customs office. You can imagine that this is not particularly exciting. He is one of the leaders of an attempted coup that we haven't really talked about too much of 1932. He's condemned to death, sentenced to death, but he manages to flee to Portugal. And he becomes what people have said, the planner of the 1936 uprising. What is interesting, after they say, okay, we're going now, let's push all the buttons and we're going to have an uprising, he decides to fly back to Spain, to go to Madrid and take over the government, become the head of this uprising. And that was accepted at a particular stage. The problem for him is that he jumps in the plane, tries to take off, the plane crashes, and on the 20th of July, he is dead. Now, there are stories that there's a particular reason as to why he died, and that is apparently his plane was overloaded, whether it's true or not, but there are some rumors, some stories. And the reason for that is it was a very small plane. He jumps in, but he then also demands that all the suitcases with all his clothes and uniforms are brought onto the plane because he can't land in Madrid and be improperly dressed. That means too much weight on the plane can't really take off, and it crashes as it's trying to take off, and he is out. So the figurehead is already out in the very, very early stages of this particular uprising. You then have another guy, and this is a brigadier general, so actually quite junior, you might say, and he is Emilio Mola, and he becomes known as the director, which already tells you one or two things. So he is, you might say, the brains behind the operation, behind the uprising. So he pulls all the strings. Also fought in Morocco, so Northern Africa, the Spanish colony. You can see there is a theme developing here. In 1930, he becomes Director General of Security. In 1935, he's then also pushed away and pushed out, and he becomes the military governor of Pamplona, which is not the most important place in Spain at that time. But he is, as I said, he's the brain, he's the thinker behind this. And when everything happens, he is made the commander of the nationalist troops in the north. And while he's fighting, he's also fighting quite successfully, so he's a very good troop commander as well. So he's a highly successful general and also a thinker. However, he's also killed in an air crash, and that's on the 3rd of June 1937. So lots of air crashes happening here in the leading circles. There are some people that say that maybe Franco had something to do with this. Never proven. It's a rumor, but a number of air crashes happen that take out you might say, the leading people at this particular stage. And that leaves one person. And that person, of course, is the person that everybody knows. And even if you haven't dealt with the Spanish Civil War before, you will have heard the name. And that is Franco, El Caudillo, the leader, as he becomes known. So he is the son of a very junior Spanish military officer who is stationed to the northwest of Spain in a naval garrison. And nothing really seems to suggest that he's going to become a big leader. He joins the military academy at Toledo, which is also there. But he's very small. He doesn't really have a command voice. People make fun of his voice. So they say that he sounds a bit like a young girl. So you look at him and think, probably not him. He's not particularly impressive. Even by Spanish standards of the day, he's quite short. So people think, you know what, he's not this charismatic leader that, for example, Mola was. And you say, probably not. But then a few things happen. The first thing is because of his upbringing and also the fact that he goes to the Spanish military academy, his worldview, of course, begins to form. So he very much thinks along military lines. He thinks about honor and glory and the eternal glory of Spain. And then something happens, which most people probably don't really have on the radar, but that's 1898, and that's the Spanish-American War. Because in this Spanish-American War, Spain loses the last number of meaningful colonies, Cuba and the Philippines. And that you might say sends some slight shockwaves through the country. They still think it's a great country. They still think, well, there is some sort of idea behind the Spanish ruling parts of the world. But this really puts a dent into this whole thing. Because, you know, there's nothing we can do against these new rising powers who, of course, let's face it, are also predominantly Protestant, not even Catholic. So he then swears to himself, and he writes about it and says, I know I only serve the Spanish crown. That's all he wants to do, to bring back glory to the Spanish crown and to the country as well. He then, as a lot of them did, he goes to North Africa. And in North Africa, he really makes his name. He goes there as a junior officer. He has a number of these local troops and the legionnaires, as they're called, that he commands. And he's extremely effective. Like most of these troops in that part of the world, his troops are also extremely brutal in the conduct of war. So a lot of nasty things happen as well. But he is very successful. He's very badly wounded as well. He's shot in the stomach once. And when he returns from there, he returns as the most highly decorated Spanish officer of the entire military. So suddenly the views change. So here's a guy who doesn't look impressive, who's got a funny voice, who doesn't look like he's even going to make, lieutenant colonel, but he comes back as the most highly decorated Spanish officer from this war zone, you might say, where they all prove that their military worth. And as a consequence, even though he's still very, very junior, he becomes chief of the general staff in 1935. So he's now top dog. He's got the job that he's always wanted. Cheeses off a lot of people because in those days, promotion happened very much along the line of the idea of service spent and length of service in the military. So it was a very slow and gradual process. So he jumps the queue and jumps up the line and the ladder. But he is successful. He even supported, basically crushing an uprising in the northern parts of Spain as well, where you have in these coal mining areas, you have the workers rising up against the existing regime. Very typical, you might say, again, for that particular period. You find that all over Europe. And he goes in there relatively heavy-handedly with these troops from North Africa. And as he would say, brings back order, which in many cases also means death and destruction. But there is peace and quiet, and that is still under the old regime. So he's still loyal, you might say. And when the revolution happens, the uprising, he also sits on the fence for quite some time. He's not quite sure how to behave, what to do. He's been pushed to the side. He sits on one of these Spanish islands, basically in the middle of nowhere, and that is the chief of the general staff. He's also been demoted now, and he sits there waiting out his time. And when the revolution happens, he is not 100% committed to begin with. That only happens a little bit later. It's very interesting as well. So you might say he's also very shrewd political thinker, that particular person. He also has got very interesting connections. So, for example, there is then a plane that lands on the island where he is to take him to the Spanish mainland. That is paid for by a British person. You can see all sorts of really interesting things that are going on there in that time. And we now look at the different camps that you have. So we've got these leaders. Two of them are out, one immediately, one a little bit later, about a year later. And then you've got Franco as the main leader. But you've got all these different factions that I already mentioned. So let's have a quick look at these factions and what these really are. So both camps are really a mixture of troops. It's far too easy to say you've got Republicans, Democrats, and then you've got nationalists. That is far too simplistic. I already said when you look at the Republican camp, you've got all sorts of different factions. You've got anarchists, you've got communists, socialists, the liberal urban elite. You've got some conservatives, you've got separatists who say, okay, we want an independent Catalonia, for example. So really, really difficult to control. And that gets forgotten quite often because when we think about this faction, this group, we think they are, of course, Republicans. We also tend to think that they're very, very left-leaning, mainly because of the International Brigades that are sent there. I'll talk about them a little bit later. But you can see it is far more complex. You also have complexity on the nationalist side. You have the clergy, because they believe in the importance of the Catholic Church. You've got the old military elites. You've got the landowners. You've got the monarchists. You might say these all form some sort of symbiotic relationship. It would be too easy to say they're all the same, but you can see they understand each other. This is the old elite of the country. But you then also have this very big movement of the Falange, that I already mentioned, under José Primo de Rivera, the son of the other Primo de Rivera that we mentioned earlier. As I said, fascist is probably too strong a word, but they're in many, many ways a little bit anti some of the old established ideas. So they probably believe in the Catholic Church. They're not really from the elite, the land-owning elite. They're not really monarchists. They're called Carlists in those days in Spain. They don't want this as well. They want a different system, leaning a little bit towards some sort of fascist system. So even there, you've got all sorts of real big problems. And this is a big movement. So it's a little bit, if you want to compare this a little bit comparable perhaps to the SA movement in Germany in the early 1930s. Think the Night of the Long Knives, if you've ever heard of this. So again, very, very complex, very, very, very difficult. He is arrested very early on during the uprising, and he's then executed in Madrid on the 17th of November 1936. Later on, after the war, he's buried in a very, very famous place, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is called the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. I'll return to that later, but keep that in mind because it is an important story post-conflict. And then we look at the forces that they've got. So what military force do you actually have? But on the Republican side, what you do find is again a mix. Of course, you have most of the officers going towards the other side because they're more conservative, they believe in the military, all these things. So you are left with an army which has been weakened, which is now controlled by people who don't really understand the higher thinking of the military, higher tactics, operational thought. One of the problems that you find in a lot of armies at that time, also think the Red Army, think other armies where you have these problems as well. The Navy, on the other hand, predominantly stays with the Republicans, which is also interesting because it causes problems for the nationalists later on when they try to get troops from North Africa to the Spanish mainland. You also have, and that is perhaps the most interesting aspect here, and the one that everybody knows and everybody talks about when you talk about the Spanish Civil War, we do have the International Brigades. These are about 40,000 strong in total, but only about 18,000 are in the conflict at a time. Roughly speaking, about 10,000 from France and Germany, and then you've got Austria, about 5,000, Italy, 3,500, and other individuals like George Orwell, for example, who of course writes a very, very famous book about his time in the Spanish Civil War in Catalonia as well. And these are the guys that everybody always talks about because to us they are you might say, the embodiment of what's the right word? The righteous system, the support of the world for freedom and democracy. You go to places like Berlin, East Berlin, there's a big memorial to the International Brigades. There's one in London and in lots of other places. The interesting thing is that these were never organized properly by governments. Even the British and the French government didn't do this because they thought, well, if we get engaged here on an official level, that will drag us into a war. So it was all done very much, you might say, on an individual basis or along party lines. So the socialist and communist parties, for example, in London, had recruiting offices. You went there, you said, I would like to join the National Brigade. They gave you a passport, gave you some money, told you this is the ship you need to take, that's the train, and then go somewhere and you will be met by people and you will be trained. These guys, when they arrive, are taken first of all, into an area in central Spain, not all that far from Madrid, where they receive some initial training. When you read the accounts and the reports, they're quite damning about this. So you have a number of people who are veterans from the First World War, who still know how to handle a rifle. You've got a lot of people who don't know this. Orwell is a very good example. And then you have these people who are training them. And because the Spanish army, unless you went to North Africa at that time, didn't see a lot of action, and then suddenly you're trained by NCOs who never seen any action. And it's really interesting when you read the accounts from these international brigades, and they go there very eager to do some fighting. And they say for the next 5 weeks, all we did was left turn, right turn, because they didn't know what else to do with us. There are a lot of very heated discussions because a lot of these people going there are used to political debates, and they start asking questions. And as you can imagine, at that level in the military, it's never a good thing to ask too many questions. They're supposed to do as they're told, and they don't. So you can see all sorts of interesting problems. Another one is languages. How do you organize troops like this? In the end, what they tried to do is to organize them along national and language lines. It didn't always work, and there is another very, very big complicating factor. We all talk about them because there is embodiment, but to be perfectly honest, from a military point of view, their value is very low. The international brigades do not save the war, do not save the republic. There are a number of instances where they play a role, but I would argue the most important role they play is in the political area because the government can turn around and say, well, here's the world supporting us. Probably shatters a few myths as well. That's what we do here. That's what we're here for, because we always hear about the International Brigades, how important they are. From a pure military perspective, they are not. And we return to a number of engagements and battles where they fight later on when we look at this. You then have the other big supporter of the Republican regime, and that is actually the Soviet Union. A lot of people don't talk about the Soviet Union because we tend to concentrate on the Germans, of course, fighting for the other camp. But we now have the Soviet Union as well, and they send a lot of troops, men, material, and all these things. So they send weapons, they send military advisors, and the military advisors that they send, they tend to take over the conduct of operations. So they are really, really important. Again, you've got problems there, language barriers, for example, because most of these guys don't speak Spanish. The number of Spanish who speak Russian in those days is also very limited. So again, you can see there are tensions that you can find here. They send about 800 aircraft, so that's quite a big chunk. 340 tanks, about 1,500 artillery pieces, and these military advisors, in the end, about 2,000. So that's a very high number. Now, we might say, well, this is brilliant. They do this to save Spain from fascism or nationalism or whatever. To a degree, yes. On the other hand, they also get paid quite handsomely because the Spanish gold reserves, which are, of course, kept in Madrid, are shipped to Moscow because the Russians say, well, or the Soviets, we should say, not the Russians, the Soviets, we should keep this because who knows what happens, so it's going to be safe in Moscow. And then, of course, they use this and tell the Spanish, well, this is now the payment for the support that we gave you. So basically, the money is gone. You've got other countries sending small contingents or other things. For example, Mexico. No one's got these guys on the list. They send some weapons and some money. Interesting again, Britain doesn't really do anything officially. France says we're going to send moral support. That's all that France does, because they are worried. As I said, if you're going to be dragged into this war, this is going to be difficult. There's an embargo of Spain by all the major Western nations to contain this conflict as well. And that's an interesting one as well, because you've got French, British, and also German warships patrolling the seas. And here's another little tangent. Say, while they're out there and patrolling, the German pocket battleship Deutschland is bombed by the Republicans. People say there was a bit of a mistake. They thought there was a nationalist ship, but that doesn't really matter. In retaliation, the Germans then fire 4 rounds into a Spanish harbor. A number of Germans get killed, and these guys are then brought to Gibraltar. And in Gibraltar, so the British territory of Gibraltar, they are buried with full military honors. So there are pictures, if you want to see them, just Google them, type in German burial at Gibraltar, and you can see these German sailors and their coffins draped in the swastika flag, taken to the main cemetery at Gibraltar, where they're buried with full military honors. And that's where they remain for a very, very short time, because Hitler then says, well, that's not really a good idea, we should bring them back. So they're then exhumed, and the bodies are taken back to the Deutschland, the ship, and then that sails back to Germany. But you had a time where the swastika flag was taken through Gibraltar for a German military burial, which is quite interesting when you think about this. And then when we look at the other side, we've got, of course, the Nationalist Army. The army is relatively small to begin with, because you only really have the support from the officers, some units in some areas, particularly the south. But the bulk of the army goes to the Republicans together with the Navy. But what you do have is, and this is really the crucial part, is you have the support of the troops in North Africa. The numbers, again, are reasonably small, but these are the battle-hardened, combat-experienced troops. They're also quite frightening because of the way they conduct the fights and how they sometimes behave. So, these guys are really, really important and are really, really useful for the battle. But the problem, of course, is they sit in North Africa. How can you get them across when you have the Republican Navy controlling the sea? Well, this is where the next country comes in. That's, of course, is probably the most famous one in the international arena here, and this is Germany. The Germans sent volunteer forces down to Spain. And of course, they become known, you might have heard this name before, as the Legion Condor, the Condor Legion. And we always think this is just an air force because there's a Condor in there and all these things. No, it's not. So it's an air force contingent plus also an army contingent. In the early stages, the important thing is the air force, you might say, around, in the end, roughly speaking, 600 aircraft, transport aircraft, Ju-52, fighter aircraft, bombers, all these things. in the very early stage, the most important one of these transport planes, the Arndt U, as the Germans called it, the Ju-52, because they now create an airlift to fly the troops from North Africa into southern Spain. In total, the Germans sent around 16,000 troops. I already said about 600 planes, about 200 tanks, and quite a bit of money, most of which was actually spent on the Condor Legion. So about 62% of that. But there is more money that they also give. So the numbers are actually relatively small. But of course, they're famous because they used this area as the testing ground for what then happens in 1939. And of course, there are a number of incidents which are linked to the Condor Legion. The most famous one is Guernica. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the number is small, and they're all volunteers. So if you wanted to go there, technically and officially, you had to leave the German military, become a volunteer, take off your national insignia of uniform, become a volunteer, and then get sent down there. Everyone knew, of course, that was a bit of a scam, you might say, but that's how it technically worked, because Germany was a neutral country. And the other country that we quite often don't really talk about when it comes to this, because Germany overshadows everything when it comes to the support of the nationalists, is Italy. The Italy supports the fight with the Navy, also the Air Force, and also an army contingent. At the peak, you've got about 50,000 Italians there. So this is by far the largest foreign national support for the war. We don't tend to talk about that very, very much for interesting reasons. Again, when you look at what they sent, about 660 aircraft, about 150 tanks, and about 800 guns. So this is also a very, very strong contingent and a very strong factor that the nationalists can use. So we've now set the scene for the actions. We've looked a little bit at the very, very ancient history of Spain, which is important if you want to understand how Spain, you might argue, functions even today, and bring it all the way forward to the outbreak of the war in 1936. And we also looked a little bit at the different contingents that we have, the different factions. And I hope you could see that the whole picture is extremely complex and extremely confusing that you find. It's not black and white. There's a lot of grey that you can find in Spain at that particular time. And I think this is a good time to stop for today. And then I will pick up the story and the narrative of the war itself in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this, what we might call the scene setting, and I hope that you tune into the next session and that if you watch this, that you will watch us. I wouldn't say we will see us because I'm not going to see you, but you know what I mean. Hope to see and hear you soon.
You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.